Welcome to the Build Beyond podcast, where we challenge and guide so that you can meet your full potential. I'm your host, Chris Netley. My guest for episode 2 is Denise Lovinger. Denise is a registered dietitian nutritionist and a certified diabetes educator with over 30 years of experience. In this episode, Denise and I discuss the benefits of carbs and some of the controversy around low carbohydrate diets. So today, Denise, we're talking about carbs. I want to start off with a little story. So this is a typical conversation that I have, I would say at least once a month, maybe more, with patients. So when people come in and they're in pain, we're looking at all the different possible things that could be contributing to it. And diet, even if it's not directly causing pain, can certainly influence it. So I ask people what they're eating, and I will get people from time to time, and actually it's been a little bit more common lately, where someone will say something like, very proudly, they'll say, I don't eat any carbs. And I'll say, okay, well, that's impressive. So what does your diet look like? You're just eating chicken and steak and fish and just 100% animal products? And they say, no. I eat a salad every day. I eat fruit. So this highlights a fundamental, I think, misunderstanding. And for those of you who are listening or watching, if you haven't caught on to that yet, that produce, fruits and vegetables, are predominantly carbohydrate. So I think when people think about carbs, what comes to mind are cookies, soda, candy, bread, things like that. But people don't often realize that, and then they associate that with negative, something that's negative or bad, which I think we'll talk about today, but why maybe that's not the case, but that they don't realize that the macronutrient carbohydrate is found in some of the most nutritious foods that we have available to us that are available in nature. So is this something that I imagine that I just skim the surface with patients, but this has got to be something that you deal with commonly. So can you talk to us about the misconception of carbohydrates?
Sure. And that is something that most clients come into my office and say as well, particularly if they've just been diagnosed with diabetes or they're trying to lose weight. Well, I don't eat bread or fruit. That's kind of the two big things. So carbohydrates are a nutrient, provides energy primarily for our brain and our muscle cells. So we can't survive without the glucose that is broken down from those carbohydrates. And some of the healthiest foods for our guts, for our cardiometabolic system, for insulin resistance, coming from foods that are high in carbohydrates, such as beans, sweet potatoes, baked potatoes, whole wheat bread, whole grains, some vegetables and fruits. So I do think all of us think carbs are bad because we know popping candy is bad. So I agree with everything you just said, and that's absolutely my experience when I see clients.
Well, you've been in the business for a long time. Has it always been this negative?
I would say in the past 15 years that negativity has grown. High protein, low carbohydrate diets have been around since I began my practice. However, I remember Atkins was very popular in the 90s. We actually had a test group here for that diet at the hospital. Our CEO asked me to do that for a year and did a mini study on 12 employees that we had. The results were not what my CEO had hoped for. It did not work for a long period of time. That diet has very good results for 6 months, but not much past that. But I would say in the past 10 years with the advent of social media is when this information has gotten more and more confusing, and I hear more and more of this negativity about carbohydrates.
Well, you mentioned that carbohydrate is a source of energy. I mean, what is it? I mean, I think it's like this mystical thing, like a calorie, where people are like,
Sure.
I don't even know what that is.
Sure. A carbohydrate is a macronutrient that our body requires for almost every bodily function that we do. It can be a simple carbohydrate, kind of like the sugar in the candy, or it can be more of a complex carbohydrate that has fiber. It's our main fuel source, as I said. It helps our gut health and our gut microbiome. We need carbohydrates and fibers to keep that healthy. And a carbohydrate is just carbons and hydrogens together, and how those are hooked together and the other contents of food that we're eating with those carbohydrates determine how that carbohydrate is used by our body. Some carbohydrates, such as those simple carbohydrates, do very quickly turn into glucose and are absorbed in our bloodstream. Those are the ones that aren't so hot for us, that can contribute to insulin resistance, which causes diabetes and PCOS and fatty liver. But those carbohydrates with fiber in them get digested more slowly, and that glucose rise is very gradual. So those kind of carbohydrates are very good for keeping us feeling satisfied, for helping our blood sugar stay stable and giving us energy.
Okay. So you've touched on why we need carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm.
Does a carb need to be certified organic to be beneficial?
No, it does not. I know there are individuals that love organic foods, and I'm not going to say anything negative about that, except that whether a food is organic or non-organic, the nutrient composition is usually the same, particularly in carbohydrates. Our body is going to recognize that carbohydrate and absorb it the same way, whether it's organic or non-organic.
What about frozen carbohydrates?
Frozen fruit and frozen vegetables are fantastic sources of carbohydrate. We don't see much difference between fresh and frozen in nutrient content, because often when food is frozen, it's fixed and frozen pretty immediately, whereas sometimes our fresh produce sits under lights in the grocery stores for a long period of time, and that can decrease the nutrient composition a little bit.
I remember you talked about that a couple years ago when I met you, and I had never really critically thought about it. And I was like, oh, yeah, I waste a lot of money on fresh fruit that goes bad. And I would say
Right.
we've made a switch at our house. We eat actually a lot of frozen fruits and vegetables because I can heat up just as much as I need to. It stays good
Right.
forever. It tastes exactly the same. So
Absolutely.
I think it's a great
Fiber,
option.
it is. Fiber content is not diminished when it's frozen as well. So
Okay.
it's
What
good.
are the recommended daily allowances for carbohydrate intake?
It varies by individual. I would say most individuals need 45 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per meal. It varies so much based on your weight, what your nutrition goals are. Athletes need much more carbohydrate if you're a very active person. It depends on if you have diabetes. Some people with diabetes may need less carbohydrate than somebody without diabetes. So I really make those goals individual to clients that I'm seeing. And I think that's really important to know, that not one size fits all. And a lot of people get in trouble with their weight loss goals or their diabetes goals if they're trying to follow the same thing as their next door neighbor. I've got a great example of that. I had a gentleman who had diabetes. He had a very active job. He was 6'2", and his mother has diabetes, who was 5'3", overweight and inactive. And she told him he could only have 1,200 calories a day and 30 grams of carbohydrate per meal, because that's what her dietitian told her. So he did that and became a little malnourished and had a very difficult time. And he came and saw me, and we discussed that. And I do think people see that standard amount of carbohydrate, which often is under 100 grams a day. Some I've seen people, influencers on social media, say under 50 grams a day, but it's very individual.
I'm someone who's gone through pretty much every fad diet personally at some point. And one thing that I notice is common with many of them is they restrict something. And
Yes.
it's some type of, I don't know, it's usually a massive restriction. Either it's a massive restriction of carbohydrates or you're not eating for big parts of the day. And not to knock any of those diets, because I'm sure they work for some people. But for most of my patients, they have also tried a lot of that and nothing has worked, or maybe only worked for a short period of time, or they didn't ultimately get the results that they wanted. And, working in an integrated health center, I do see, I have selection bias because I only see people coming in who are unhealthy or sick or in pain.
True.
But I do see, especially in a student population, a decent amount of disordered eating. And not to say that people have eating disorders, but there is this almost compulsive desire to restrict food. And I wonder, for someone who deals with this all day, every day, do you feel like people who get in this mode of like, carbs are bad, I need to restrict carbohydrates, does that have any correlation with disordered eating?
I think any restriction can set someone on a path for more disordered thoughts surrounding food. A lot of times with carbohydrates, if they're not sufficiently following a lower carbohydrate diet by adding other nutrients, it can affect their cognitive function a little bit when we're not nourishing our brain well. And I do think restrictions set people on that path. Carbohydrates aren't always restricted because of a disordered eating thought. However, I think that is just part of our culture right now. We just have a very difficult time getting away of that. And I think all the evidence on social media and well-meaning friends and family that are telling their siblings and friends not to eat carbohydrates, I don't know that's always disordered eating, but it can become disordered eating if it's a pattern time and time again. I can't tell you how many people I have seen who have restricted carbohydrates, lost weight, gained it, restricted again, lost it, gained it back. And they come and see me after doing this for years and years. And you too, you've been seeing this. And then it becomes very difficult to manage weight and disease prevention after you put your body through that year after year. Not impossible, but it's more difficult for people.
Yeah, and I want to clarify too for the listeners or the viewers. I wouldn't suggest that having a restricted diet is going to cause an eating disorder, but I do see patterns, and so it's not like, I wouldn't say that restricting carbohydrates is going to cause an eating disorder,
No.
but most of the patients that I've dealt with who either have a clinically diagnosed eating disorder or just have disordered eating patterns, they are restricting carbohydrates or have gone through that. So I don't think it's a cause or effect, but it's one of those, it's a mentality about food that you can't be healthy unless you restrict. And it seems like carbs are the villain, at least right now, for a lot of people.
I believe so. And I do think that's just when people are thinking of losing weight or thinking about changing their diet, that's the first thing I do think they think of now.
Okay.
So I heard, no, it's just that I think they think, I've heard carbs are bad. That's what I'm going to restrict.
Yeah. I want to talk about some good stuff about carbs then. I want to talk about fiber. Because fiber seems to be one of those recommendations in nutrition that hasn't changed a whole lot. Like, fiber was good 20 years ago. It still seems to be good now. Can you talk to us about why fiber is good? And what is fiber?
Yeah. So fiber is part of a plant that our bodies don't digest very well. So when you eat fiber, you have a slower transit time from your stomach because it takes a while for your stomach to break that fiber down and actually digest it. And what that does with the other food that you are digesting at the same time is it slows its absorption into your bloodstream. So in the case of a person with diabetes, or the case of you and I that we want to prevent diabetes, it's making our glucose in our bloodstream much more slowly because that fiber takes a long time to digest. And that prevents insulin spikes and decreases insulin resistance in the long run. The other good thing about fiber is it lowers our LDL cholesterol. We've known this for years. Since I graduated in the late 80s is when they first started studying what fiber does with cholesterol levels. So we know that it lowers that. It helps keep us regular. A high fiber diet we know can maybe prevent colorectal cancers and other types of cancers perhaps. But the newest research about what fiber does is it keeps our gut microbiome healthy. And I think most listeners have heard about our guts and these bacteria that live in our intestinal tract that actually can prevent disease and improve our mental health. And fiber is the number one thing that bacteria likes to eat. So there's all kinds of studies now talking about fiber being important in the prevention of diabetes, insulin resistance diseases, cardiac disease, and many forms of cancer.
I did a deep dive into some fiber research not too long ago, and it almost got boring because I kept reading the same thing over and over again.
Yeah.
About like there's no negative side effect unless you somehow consume so much fiber that it gives you the runs. Which I came across on some forums. Some vegan maybe eat that much fiber where it actually becomes a problem, but it seems
Yes.
like it's pretty rare and it's easy. You just stop. You just eat less. But
Right.
so essentially, no negative side effects, only positive potential benefits. At the very least, it just makes you feel full. And then the foods and our natural sources of fiber tend to be nutrient dense, very filling. A lot of them actually have good sources of protein. So you're getting a kind of a triple whammy there.
Yeah. And other nutrients, I always talk about beans as being one of the healthiest foods. Beans contain magnesium, potassium, plus the fiber and the carbohydrate and the energy that you need. And just to go back to mention about the bad side effects, I always remind people, if you are eating a low amount of fiber and you want to eat a higher amount of fiber, you really do need to very gradually increase the amount of fiber you eat over about 3 to 4 weeks, or then you can have some very uncomfortable bloating and some uncomfortable GI issues going on. And I do see people often do that. I always have to be very careful. I actually write a step-by-step approach for all of my patients. Okay, this week you're going to try this, because that can cause some problems. And people eating too much fiber, I am seeing more and more than I used to. I have a lot of women complain about bloating and abdominal pain. And when we kind of look at what they're eating, some of them are eating 40 or 50 grams of fiber a day, because they read it was good for their gut. So I am starting to see that more often.
That's hard to do.
It's very hard. The recommendations for women are 25 grams per day. For men, it's about 38 grams. And it is difficult to get 25 grams in.
Yeah, I can't even. I track my fiber, or I did for a while, and to put down 50 grams for me, and I'm about 220 pounds. Yeah, that's still like, you almost have to like consciously plan out that much fiber, unless you're just eating fruit all day, which maybe they are.
Yeah, it's amazing what they're eating.
Well, what do you think about supplementing with things like Metamucil?
I think that's helpful if it's necessary. I mean, there are some people, right, that can't tolerate certain fibers. People that have irritable bowel syndrome or some other diverticulosis. There are some people that can't tolerate certain foods, so it's difficult to get to that fiber level. I have a lot of patients that refuse to eat vegetables and fruits, don't like beans, don't even like nuts. So if you do not like high fiber foods, I do recommend Metamucil. It's that important. But I always like to do food first. But Metamucil can be very helpful if you have high cholesterol and you're not going to eat the food. Food always works better. Metamucil can work. Not as well, but it can help.
Yeah, I had someone the other day ask me that question, and I kind of said something similar, is that you don't like natural fiber, or you can't tolerate it. And they said, no, I just thought it'd be a quicker way. And it's like, yeah, but you're missing out on all the health benefits, like all the other health benefits from eating the real food. So, I mean, like, if you're going to be traveling, or you're in a situation where you're not going to have access to fiber foods, and you're used to eating fiber, it could be beneficial. And just like what you said, with people who actually have medical conditions where they can't tolerate it. But when I look into some of the most nutrient dense foods, and we look at, especially people who, in cultures that typically live long, disease-free lives, it's generally, there's a good amount of fiber in those diets.
Absolutely. And almost all of them. Yeah, no doubt about that.
And the interesting thing about fiber too is that there aren't a lot of fiber deniers out there. I mean, you're going to get into, I feel like there's a lot of arguing, but I think the carnivore crew would probably be the only ones who don't incorporate a lot of fiber. But even from from their messaging, and I'm just getting this off of social media and things like that, most of them still eat fiber, just not very much. So they, like someone on carnivore will eat fruit, just not a lot of it, and they won't necessarily claim that fiber doesn't do everything that the research says it does. They'll just downplay the effects. So I know that they'll say like LDL levels don't really matter and things like that. So yeah, it'll affect it, but it's ultimately not a big deal. But I think that kind of almost strengthens the case for fiber, because even people who, swear by diets that are low in fiber are still going to acknowledge the fact that fiber has an effect,
Absolutely.
and where a lot of things just are not effective. And one of them that and we're not going to go into huge detail on supplements right now, but taking just a over-the-counter probiotic for no reason, I have not found any research to show that that has any benefit. There can be specific examples where it might be beneficial or maybe even is required, but just general supplementation of a probiotic is not necessarily going to affect your gut health in a positive or negative way. But eating fiber does. And there's, like you said, like it's a mountain of research showing, and it's growing now. It's becoming more of a thing where we can, if you're someone out there and you're like, I really want to have a healthy gut, I take a lot of probiotics. I'm not saying to stop taking your supplements, but I would say look at your fiber intake and make sure that it's adequate, because to your point, there is research to show that that's going to be hugely beneficial for gut health, or at least there's a possibility.
Absolutely. And it's the number one researched nutrient for our guts.
I'm going to throw something at you here. Have you heard of the 800-gram challenge?
I haven't.
Okay. So I've been playing around with this. Let me pull this up. So this was created, I'm going to butcher this woman's name, but her name is E.C. Sinkowski. She's a registered dietitian, and she came up with this thing called the 800-gram challenge. I've been presenting this to some of my students at the college, and then I've been kind of using it with patients because I've been playing around with it for about a year now, and it is ridiculously easy, and that's what I like it. So she was running into some of the issues that I'm sure that you have come across over the years, where people are confused. It's like, well, I gotta have this much of this and this much of this, and I've got to make sure I get this and this. There's all these requirements, and no one can agree. So she came across some research suggesting that 800 grams a day of produce, fruits or vegetables, was going to show was going to produce some type of positive outcome. So she was like, okay, what does that even look like? And she kind of played around with it and decided 800-gram challenge. That's your goal. 800 grams by weight per day. I'm not gonna. It can be fresh, cooked, frozen, or canned, as long as it's canned in water. There's a lot of stuff that counts. So obviously fruits and vegetables, but tofu, beans, tomato sauce without added oil or sugar, potatoes, corn, peas, avocados, pickles, and fermented veggies, olives, fruit compounds like applesauce, as long as it doesn't have added sugar. Things that don't count: dried fruit, like plant-based milks like oat milk, juices, jellies, jams, and then fried veggies like fries. And there's a little bit more to it than that. She does give a way to do it without weighing. It's about 800 grams is about 6 cups. Unless you're doing leafy greens, it gets a little bit different there. So now the nice thing about this that she kind of talks about is that, well, we've kind of already touched on, is so much about diet is always like, what do we have to restrict? And this is not restricting. This is just adding stuff in. So I've done this, and I give an example to my students. This is what I did on a Saturday. This is not my whole diet, but this is everything that meets the 800-gram challenge. I had 220 grams of frozen blueberries, which is about a cup and a half. So that would have been, for me, with oatmeal and chia seeds. For a morning snack, I had a banana, which was when I weighed it, was 108 grams. With lunch, I had some frozen broccoli, 100 grams, an orange, and for an afternoon snack, I had 3/4 of an apple, which came out to 142 grams. So I probably shared the other quarter with my daughter. And then with dinner, 130 grams, which is about half a cup of canned beans. So by weight, that came out to 822 grams. That does not sound like a lot of food. And if you look at the total fiber content, and the 800-gram challenge is not specifically about fiber, but I just was curious to see what it was.
Right.
It came out to 22.5 grams of fiber. And that doesn't account for everything else I ate. So it doesn't account for oatmeal. It doesn't account for the chia seeds.
Chia seed.
I usually eat rice with beans. Sometimes I'll have bread. So with just doing the 800-gram challenge, 22.5 grams of fiber is pretty good. I definitely met my fiber goal for that day with everything else that I ate. And if you think about that, that's not hard to do. Like that wasn't, I planned it out a little bit. I did game the game a little bit, but I used frozen or canned, or if it was fresh, it was stuff that's readily available, like bananas and oranges. And it was pretty simple. And I've given it to a few patients, or the idea, and they found it to be very positive.
So what I tell my patients instead of that is I do tell them get 6 grams of fruit or 6 cups of fruits and vegetables a day. So I also will always, I'm not a dietitian of restriction. I'm always telling them what to eat. So I do it that way, a little differently. Yeah, get 6 cups of fruits and vegetables. I don't have them weigh it. I have them measure it out sometimes. So I think that's great. That's a great way to think about it. That's cool. And that just shows what you ate. As you said, it's not hard. It's not a lot of food. You're probably full and satisfied all day. It's just, it's not hard to do. If you think about adding a cup of fruit at each meal, a cup of vegetables here, 2 cups of vegetables at dinner. Yeah, so that's cool.
What does it look like working with a dietitian? Or I guess that's a loaded question because you don't know every dietitian out there. But
working with me.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
so for the listeners and the watchers, Denise is a clinician. She sees patients, so you could actually reach out and get an appointment with her if you needed one. But I feel like there's a stigma with someone who's going to be talking about nutrition, and here's why I hate talking about nutrition. I do it, but I absolutely hate it. It's because it's like talking to people about politics or religion. It's like, who'd you vote for? It's essentially what I'm asking. And they're just like, don't judge me. I don't want to tell you what I eat late at night. I don't want to tell you what I feed my kids because you're going to judge me for the way I parent. I don't want you to think about what my parents fed to me and judge them. And I don't, you know what I mean? It's such a oddly personal subject.
Very personal subject.
How do you get around? Like, what is it like to come in and sit down with you? Or are you just like, tell me all your secrets now?
Right. It's very personal. And I learn a lot about patients when you start talking about food, because it does affect our when we grew up and our backgrounds and our memories and how we're feeling. So I just take a very non-judgmental approach. I am very much with motivational interviewing, just finding out why they're here, specifically what their goals are, what they're hoping to accomplish. And I get to know their life, what they're eating during the day, what their sleep patterns are like, what they're doing during the day physically, who they're eating with. We talk a lot about emotions surrounding eating. You and I have talked about this before. There are a lot of people that don't have eating disorders, but cope with food in negative ways sometimes based on a history of doing that, or that's the only coping mechanism they've ever had for stress or boredom or something like that. So I really try to get to know them and assess them. And then we work together on making small changes. I work on very gradual, small changes at a time. When someone tells me they do not like vegetables and they refuse to eat it, I'm not going to discuss that any further at that appointment. But usually 3 months down the road, I'll give them a recipe. Try this at home, and then maybe they'll start eating vegetables again. So it's very individual, and it's very much counseling sometimes, as you know, working with patients. I do not have them come in and hand them this diet to follow, or here's what you have to eat for the next 2 weeks. We just talk about what's most important for their health to change first, and then work on things gradually. And then I refer them to people like you or to a counselor if that's necessary. But that's what it's like coming to see me. I don't judge. I eat very well, but I'm certainly not the most perfect eater, you know. We all do our things. Yeah, I usually try to work with people depending on their goals, several visits. For people trying to manage weight or diabetes, I usually try to see them at least 6 times that first year that they're diagnosed or the first year they're trying.
Yeah. You said something interesting now that I picked up on. You said something that you said, I'm not the most perfect eater.
Mhm.
And I think that's interesting because I feel like people are going to look at someone like you and be like, well, she probably eats perfectly. And I'm going to put perfect in air quotes because I don't
Right.
really know what perfect means. What I know what it means for you because I know you is that
Hmm.
sometimes you'll eat a candy bar or you'll have
Exactly.
dessert or you might
Yep.
get fast food or eat a piece of pizza. You're not
Exactly.
going to completely restrict everything
Right.
that might, because there's a social component to food, and
Yes.
there's a happiness there.
Hmm.
And I feel like, I don't know, I feel like there's a lot of people who go on diets and they just become unhappy, and then there's no, how do you just keep going for, like, okay, now you got to be unhappy with your food choices for the rest of your life. My wife and I have changed some things at home. I used to be a big like spaghetti squash person for whatever reason. And I don't hate spaghetti squash, but I don't particularly like it.
Hmm.
And I like spaghetti. So what we started doing was, if we're gonna have spaghetti, we weigh out an actual portion. What we do, two servings of spaghetti noodles, which is 56 grams per serving. It is unimpressive to look at, but we get really good pasta. It tastes really good. We don't have it very often. We make a good sauce. I just know going into that meal that I'm gonna eat I'm not gonna make extra. It's just I'm gonna really enjoy this, but I'm not gonna overeat it. I'm gonna
Hmm.
actually just give myself the permission to eat something that a lot of people would be like, oh, pasta, unhealthy.
Okay. Hmm.
Um, but it's a way that we found, like, that, and this is not to knock the spaghetti squash farmers out there, but it's
Hmm.
it's not the same. You know
It's
what I
not as
mean?
satisfying. No,
Yeah,
no.
it's just
Yeah,
not, it's not the
it's
same
not.
thing. And I
Yeah.
just I feel like when I eat spaghetti with spaghetti squash, I do feel nourished and I feel full, but I don't feel satisfied in the way that like a good bowl of pasta and
Right.
makes me
Yeah.
feel. And then I hear about people talking about how they're restricting the stuff, and it's like, whew, if
Yeah.
that brings you happiness, I'm glad, but man, you are missing out on some of the best stuff in life. And I'm not here to sell pasta, but I'm just saying that, like, for me, like, pasta and chocolate, like, I just I
Right.
couldn't, I
Right.
couldn't go without it
Yeah.
forever.
Yeah. Because food does bring joy, it brings comfort, feeds our soul, I always say. So you do need to let yourself have some of those favorite things. And I do feel that when people come to see a dietitian, they feel like they're never allowed to have those things and that that's what I'm going to tell them and that that's what I do. But I always try to let people know. And another thing I hate are when people talk about cheat days.
Mm,
I'm gonna eat whatever I want, but I'm gonna have this one cheat day where you need to let those foods you're allowing on a cheat day be part of your normal rotation in your diet. But you just need to learn how to modify those a little bit, like your spaghetti sauce by adding a lot of beautiful roasted vegetables to that sauce and meat. That's going to make that meal filling and more enjoyable. Or if I have someone who wants to eat potato chips for a snack, I'll say, well, hey, why don't you add some apple slices and a handful of almonds to that? So you don't have to give up those chips, but instead of eating a whole bag, you're going to have something that's going to fill you up and still enjoy that small amount. So I think it's just reworking how we think about food that might seem to be unhealthy, um, that we can justify having and enjoying that. So
so you're saying that someone can eat the foods that they enjoy and still live a long, healthy
it's just
life, like, because that is, if you get on
believe
social
it or
media,
not,
that is not the message. You know what I
it
mean?
is
And
not.
if
Yeah.
you get on, some of the carnivore sites, well-meaning people, but it's like, man, if you're not eating raw organ meat and 3 steaks, and you get the vegans on the other side. Like, if you even look at a steak, you're probably gonna have a heart attack. And
there's the camps that just my way's the best.
camp's a good word. I was gonna say cult,
Yeah.
but I was trying to find a different word.
Well, could
Well, because
be.
it gets the people,
It does.
and I think what I try and tell my students and my patients is that when people are on social media, they are looking for your attention. So they are going to say whatever it takes to get clicks, not necessarily to make you healthy. And I'm not saying that people are on there are trying to make you unhealthy. They might be well-meaning, but they're also trying to run a business through gaining your attention. And so the idea that, and I love that ancestral claim, because it's like, oh, this is what our ancestors ate. It's like, which continent and which time? Because it's like,
right.
it varies so much.
So much, yeah.
And I don't even know, like, and how long did they live? Like, were they relatively healthy, or you know what I mean? Like,
Right.
it's these mythical ancestors that we all had, apparently. But apparently our ancestors only ate plants, but also our ancestors only ate meat.
Meat.
Like, what
Exactly.
is it? I don't even know what we're referencing anymore.
I know. And you can imagine, you understand nutrition. I understand nutrition, and how confusing all of this is for us. You imagine the typical person out there who may not understand nutrition or read the research that we do, how confusing that can be. Which it is. It's very confusing.
It is. Well, that's a good segue, because I'm going to present a piece of research right now. I will link this in the show notes. In preparation for this, I did a deep dive into fiber and carbs, and this is something I look at anyway, just because I teach a health class, and I help patients with it a little bit. And this is a study that I don't know if particularly this is like the study, but when I looked at the totality of the research that I read, I felt like this one, I think, was the best representation of all of them. And it's very realistic. And there's a couple key things to this that I really like. So this is, again, I'm going to say this wrong, Whiteley et al. From 2012. I'll post this in the show notes. They had 123 obese or overweight males, and they took them for a year, so a whole 52 weeks. They split them into 2 groups, and they said one of you is going to eat high protein and the other one's going to eat high carbohydrate. But it's going to be isocaloric, so the amount of calories are the same. It's just a different macronutrient profile. At the end of a year, they had both diets, the high carbohydrate and the high protein, similarly reduced body weight by about 11%, and similarly improved a number of cardiometabolic risk factors. So they came out about the same. Now, the interesting thing is when we get into the details, the BMI was between 27 and 39. Age range was big, 20 to 64. They excluded unhealthy people, again, quote, that people with diabetes, that uncontrolled high blood pressure, history of GI, kidney, heart, metabolic, or liver diseases. They excluded smokers, and then they excluded anyone taking meds for blood sugar. They randomized them into the 2 groups, so either high carb or high protein. They did not do a control group, although I think for this study, it probably wouldn't have been needed. I don't think it diminishes the results any. And they all, like I said, they all ate the same number of calories for the full month. Now, the measurements that they did, they measured them at baseline, so at the beginning, then at week 12, and then again at week 52. They did height, weight, BMI, waist circumference, blood pressure, cholesterol, creatine, glucose, insulin, C-reactive protein, which is a marker for inflammation, and then they took urine samples, and then they had physical activity questionnaires, because the participants were asked not to change their lifestyle patterns, and they did not give them a physical activity or exercise prescription, which is an important point that I'm going to come back to. So now when we look at the actual diets, this is where it gets super interesting. They restricted them to 7 megajoules a day, which by my calculations is about 1,700 calories. That's low. So if you're thinking about, like, I'm 6 foot, 220 pounds. For me to eat 700 calories a day for a year, wow. You know what I mean? Like, that, not only would that be hard, but I don't know my caloric intake, but it's definitely more than 1,700. So the fact that they actually completed this study shocked me when I read that, when I did that math. Now, high protein, it was 142 grams per day, roughly, which was about 35%. So that's another interesting thing is that's not super high protein. I mean, it's higher than the RDA because, again, the math kind of works out well for me because I'm 220 pounds roughly. So it's like 100 kilos. And the RDA is 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram per day. So at the low end for me, about 80 grams. But I like eating about 150. That's kind of my sweet spot where I can put that down and it makes me feel full. And I don't consider myself a high protein person. And if you look at the percentage, there for the high protein diet, they were only eating 35% of their total caloric intake was protein. So 40% was carbohydrate. So by percentage, the high protein diet was technically a high carb diet, which is super interesting. Now the high carb diet, their carbohydrates went up obviously to 58%. Their protein was only 17%, but they were eating 88 grams of protein per day. So for someone like me, that's right around the RDA. So the high protein diet was by percentage actually a high carb diet, and the high carb diet was not a low protein diet. So they made sure they got sufficient protein. That is interesting. And if you haven't caught on to why that's interesting, I'm going to give you a summary here in a second. Here's another cool thing. The question I'm asking at this point as I'm going through the methods is how did they get these guys to eat 1,700 calories a day for a year? Like what did they hypnotize them? I mean, that to me, that's crazy. Like, because you and I deal with this. Like, how do you get people to change their habits for a year? Like, I need to learn that motivational interviewing speech that they did for that. And this is what they did. The participants met with a dietitian in the beginning, and then every 2 weeks during the first 12 weeks, and then monthly after that, the participants received detailed dietary prescription, meal planning advice, and recipe info. And then to help with the dietary pattern structure, they gave them the foods in a checklist. And the checklist is super interesting because it shows you the actual foods, which is, I think, kind of rare in research. Sometimes they're like, we did this, but they won't tell you what it is. And this is not like, these guys were not eating, free range unicorn meat or, organic vegetables grown on a magic mountain. They have, look at dairy, low fat. They had lean meat, sliced deli meat, canned fish, fresh fruit, rice, pasta, potatoes, whole grain bread, cheese, cereal. Some of these are Kellogg's brand, salad, vegetables, oils and spreads, and wine or the equivalent. So they actually let them drink alcohol. So this is a very realistic. I mean, you could go to Kroger and get this. It's not like it's relatively cheap. And to make it even better for these guys, for the first 12 weeks, they were supplied with up to 60% of their total energy intake. So they did this because to help improve compliance, because they knew initially this was going to be a problem. And it allowed them to familiarize themselves with the food types because they were going to eventually have to go buy their own food. So it wasn't just like, oh, theoretically you should be eating this. They showed them this is what you're buying. And then they gave them choices on a checklist. The participants were also required to keep daily food records. They could actually weigh, or they could just use kind of like a standard unit, like slice of bread or something like that. So they gave them some other options. And the dietitian was obviously going to look at those records. They only had 3 people drop out, which again, incredible for a year.
Yeah.
And I've already gone over the results. The only main difference between the two was that the high protein diet, they lost less fat-free mass, which by my understanding is just a marker for muscle. So they retained more muscle, which would make sense because they ate more protein. But that wasn't the purpose of the study, really. So it was kind of just like an added benefit. But again, they didn't eat they were a high protein, but it wasn't like really high. It was just like a little bit above the RDA, but still predominantly carbohydrate. So what does the study tell us? One, that we glossed over, but it's not even part of the study, is that you don't need exercise to accomplish weight loss or to improve your cardiometabolic health. Now, that is huge because you cannot exercise yourself to weight loss. Like, we know this now. We know it from the show The Biggest Loser. We know it from a lot of different other research and even from human examples that we don't really have as much control over our caloric expenditure as we think. So if you go out and run a marathon tomorrow, yes, you will burn more calories, but over a year, your body's going to even it out somehow. It's going to take energy from somewhere else. And this is important because for a lot of people, they're like, oh, to lose weight and be healthy, I have to do all of these things. And it's like, well, not necessarily. You could just focus on nutrition and it's not this like insurmountable challenge. Get that done. So I think that's a really interesting part of this that they did not make. They said don't change, don't exercise if you're not already exercising. The interesting thing too is that healthy weight loss and the improvements in cardiometabolic health took time. They gave them 50. This isn't like a 6-week study. This is not a crash diet. This is not some cleanse. They were like, look, these guys need time. We've got to find a way to give them time. So for all of you out there who are super impatient and you're like, I've been dieting and exercising for like a month and I don't see the results I want. It's like, yeah, I wouldn't expect it to. And if you did, I'm actually kind of worried because I don't think that's a sustainable effort. The third thing that's cool about this study is you can eat a high carbohydrate diet and still lose weight and improve your health. Mic drop, done. Because even the high protein diet was technically a high carb diet. So like,
Right.
I don't know if they did that. Like they replicated it with both groups. And that's why I think like they didn't have a control group, but whatever, you know what I mean? Like, again, this isn't the most perfect study, but it's such a good example for those people out there who are like, I need to lose weight and I need to get healthy and I can't eat carbs. And it's like, no, like this shows that you can, and you can accomplish these results without eating organic free range foods, because the food checklist on here is very reasonable and very normal. I mean, and they even used Kellogg's products. So it's readily available. It's important to not overeat. And I think that's one thing that they pretty much hit on. They're like, these guys, we have to find a way to get them to restrict calories for a year, but still meet recommended daily allowance for protein, carbohydrates. They were eating 25% fat, and then they were obviously trying to get a good micronutrient profile with
Right.
vitamins and minerals and all that stuff. This research also acknowledges the difficulty of not overeating. The men in the study had a lot of support. Like, that's the mind-blowing thing, that they could do this for a year and they actually only had 3 people drop out. But if you think about the support that they had, that I mean that's it. You know what I mean? Like, that's how you get from point A to
That's it.
point B over a long period of time. No, a lot of people don't climb Mount Everest on their own without a Sherpa. Like, if you've never done it before, why, having that support is vital. And I think it's important to note that these men were relatively healthy. And so I don't want someone to take this the wrong way, as like, especially if you're like diabetic or, I mean, this diet might not work for you. This experiment might not work for you, because remember, they got rid of pretty much anyone. Men were essentially healthy, just obese and overweight. So the results might not work for everybody, but I just think that this study for me was a great example. And honestly, I wish more people knew about stuff like this, because I think that I just feel like carbohydrates have been demonized so much, and there's so many potentially and real negative side effects from demonizing carbohydrates. There's some downsides to overdoing it, and you can still go low carb and not demonize it. And so I don't want to sound like, if you're out there and you're eating a carnivore diet, that's a bad thing. But do your thing. But I feel like the mentality that carbs are bad is just, it's not really serving anyone, because it's not true. The results in this study kind of fall in line with what you feel like is actually a reasonable thing. Like, this diet seem reasonable and these results seem reasonable?
I do. And the reason for that is, when I've had clients that have been successful, it's usually because they have followed something like this, where they meet all of their nutrient needs, they have adequate amounts of carb, protein, and fat. And that is a meal plan that individuals can sustain. these with diets, I have never met anybody that can sustain some of these restricted eatings. And I think the support there is really important to note as well. Most individuals don't have that kind of support, but that support can be available, maybe not as intensely, but certainly seeing a dietitian, seeing you, seeing someone to help them through all this on a regular basis helps. And the other thing I like that you brought up is it's just real food. Because when we're working with clients, we have to work with what they can afford, what they like, what's available to them, especially in Hillsdale. We don't have Trader Joe's or Whole Foods or Costco. So we have to deal with what's here. And it sounds like that's what this study did. Like you said, it was plain everyday food. So they were able to sustain that. But I have had lots of success with my clients managing their diabetes, reversing their fatty liver, losing weight on a diet that is pretty similar to the one in the study. Yeah.
I remember several years ago, I had the opportunity to talk to someone who had participated in, at some point in the federal guidelines. And I was asking him about it, and he was like, we had to make it realistic. Because I kind of questioned him on it. I was like, it doesn't really seem optimal. And he was like, well, what's optimal? It's like, what do you want me to say? Like, people need to be eating, like I said, free range, and like people can't eat, like if you tell people like, hey, you can't be healthy if you eat cereal, then they're not even going to read it. He's like, wait, you had to kind of look at the entire American population and think about something that people could actually do. And I talk about this to a lot of people with exercise when they're like, well, what's the best thing for low back pain? And it's like, whatever you'll do. Because I could come up with a program, and if you don't do it for whatever reason, then it doesn't matter how good I think it is. So it's like, if you think that, so you'll see like my patients have totally different prescriptions, and it's like, well, why are you having that person stretch and that person's walking and that person's deadlifting? It's like, I don't know, that's what they wouldn't do anything else. So like, I'm just trying to get them to take one step in the right direction. And then for the people who aren't lifting, at some point I'm probably gonna, once we get them going, have them lift a little bit. But I feel like it's a similar thing with nutrition. It's it's like all this, and I like the demonizing of like artificial sweeteners, and it's like, well, yeah, like if you're not consuming sugar or artificial sweeteners now, I wouldn't necessarily say you should just go do that. You probably could, but for someone who's drinking, a 6-pack a day of soda, if we can get them to switch to something with an artificial sweetener, even if you want to argue that artificial sweeteners are unhealthy, and I'm not going to take a side on that, but you got to admit that the reduction in sugar was probably going to be, and reduction in total calories is probably going to be beneficial, a huge effect.
Exactly.
Or you might look at diet soda and be like, well, that's not a healthy food. And it's like, it's a step in the right direction for that individual.
Correct. It is. And you have to meet individuals where they are. And for listeners out there, you have to look at where you're at right now and think about some of the things that we've said or that you've read from a reliable source and figure out what's that first small step you're willing to take. And it doesn't have to be a drastic step. It's just a little step in the right direction. And taking more and more of those over a period of time improves your health. Your blood sugar's normal. You don't have pain anymore. You're losing weight. You're feeling more energetic, whatever it is. I think that sums it up very well, what you just said.
Well, I think we could talk about carbs all day. But I want to wrap this up with a little plug for specifically for seeing you, Denise. But if Denise isn't available to you, because I think you only see patients in Michigan, correct? That's where your license is. Yeah, same thing for me. Right. So if you're in Michigan, we actually both do telehealth, so you could reach out to us. If you're not in Michigan and you like this and you're curious, you can still reach out. We can't treat you, but I could probably connect you with someone. You know what I mean? Like if you're like,
connect you.
Even if we don't know someone in that area, we could give you an idea of, give you some options. But for those who do have access to you, how do they get a hold of you? Like, what's the best way to get an appointment with you?
So I think if you can put the email in the notes, I
Okay.
think that's the best way right now is to email me. And then I usually get back with people pretty quickly. And then we
Okay.
can schedule an appointment, either telehealth or if you do have insurance, I contracted host the hospital and I can see you there at the college, wherever. I've got a private practice office as well. So yeah.
Okay. I'll put your contact info, and then
Yep.
Denise does have social media, but she doesn't use it. So I'm gonna put her Instagram up too. She might, if you DM her, she might take a while to get back to you. But
I will try to make that a little bit more important. So
well,
I looked at it after we spoke. My last posting was 2 years ago.
okay. Well,
So I need to do
maybe
that for her.
start
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
you can start doing. I think it'd be cool if you started doing some like realistic recipe videos.
Yes.
How do you make
Yes.
something delicious that's easy and relatively affordable?
Yeah, it's kind of like the example I gave you with potato chips, or the other example I'll use is mashed potatoes. I mean,
Yeah.
mashed potatoes, no fiber, not a lot of nutritional value in there, but you have some lean meat with that and a big salad, and then you have some lovely roasted Brussels sprouts that you put some shaved Parmesan on to flavor them up or something. And then those mashed potatoes are fine because you've got some protein and fiber with them. Not going to negatively impact your blood sugar or you at all. So a lot of my clients have asked me to do this. I hand them recipes, but a lot of them say, "Hey, could you do one of those, but those reels like those people do?" So that's
So
something you can help me with.
Instagram, and then you
So,
need a
so,
YouTube channel.
yeah, yeah. We'll see.
All right. Do you have any closing words or statements about carbohydrates?
Just to try and include them in your diet and to try and include fiber in your diet. The number one statement I would probably say is a carbohydrate that contains fiber at each meal will keep you satisfied and give you a little bit more energy in your day if you're not doing that right now.
All right. Sounds good.
Okay.
All right, Denise, I'm gonna let you go.
Sounds good.
I hope you enjoyed that discussion. I'm adding an epilogue to help provide some additional information and to clarify some statements made in the podcast. Denise references an informal study on the Atkins diet that she helped conduct at a local hospital. This informal trial was done years ago and we couldn't find any documentation. Denise mentions that the participants experienced some good early results on Atkins, but ultimately didn't achieve the long-term health benefits that they desired. Since we couldn't support the statement with documentation, I've linked a similar study in the show notes. The study is not specifically about Atkins diet, but more generally about low carb diets. You'll see it as PMID 33916669. The title of this is The Low Carbohydrate Diet, Short-Term Metabolic Efficiency versus Long-Term Limitations. And I'm going to read you a short portion towards the end of the paper. Despite decades of research, it is remarkable how little we actually know about the human diet. It's probably fair to say that most of us think we know more than we actually do. I know that would make Denise smile. The available evidence shows that weight loss occurs following a reduction in daily caloric intake, regardless of the macronutrient origin of those calories. Although the magnitude of weight loss varies according to the type of macronutrient and the effects of the diet-induced thermogenesis. Therefore, rather than considering the merits of the low carbohydrate versus the low fat or any other macronutrient change, perhaps our approach should simply be to limit caloric intake whilst maintaining a healthy and enjoyable diet and nurturing our gut microbiota and with fiber and plant-based foods in the process. To conclude, evidence reveals metabolic efficiency of the low carbohydrate diet, at least during the short term, which is what Denise mentioned. Unfortunately, there are substantial limitations to the low carbohydrate diet that restrict its metabolic efficiency over a longer term. So, for those of you out there who are eating low carb diets like Atkins, carnivore, or keto, and you are achieving the long-term results that you want, I'm happy for you. Keep going. But for those of you struggling with weight loss and health issues who have not achieved long-term results with low-carb diets, you do have other options. And the study that I reference in the podcast is just one good example. Okay. Later on in the podcast, Denise and I also discussed the nutrient density of canned and frozen foods compared to fresh food. We both made arguments that frozen and canned foods can be just as nutritious as fresh food. After the podcast, we did conduct a literature search and found a variety of papers. It appears that canned and frozen food can be more or less nutritious depending on the processing. We found literature that can support both sides of the argument. So at this point, it seems to me that fresh and frozen food is they're affordable sources of carbs and fiber, and they have a long shelf life. So I'm still a fan. Denise made a comment about fresh produce possibly losing its nutritional value based on light exposure. Neither of us could find any current research on the subject. There's some older stuff, but nothing current. In general, I'm not concerned about the effects of light exposure, and I don't believe Denise is either, really. If you're going to buy fresh produce and it looks good and it tastes good, I wouldn't be concerned about the nutritional value. I'd just be happy that you're eating fresh fruits and veggies. Now, if we're going to talk about the importance of carbs, I want to present a paper that deals with the importance of the quality and what does carbohydrate quality actually mean. This is PMID 3517921. Here is the end of the paper, or towards the end. It says, beyond the absolute amount of carbs consumed, there is now compelling evidence that the associations between carbohydrate intake and health-related outcomes vary according to dietary carbohydrate sources. So it's not just total calories, it is that the sources are relevant. Systematic reviews and meta-analyses of prospective cohort studies clearly indicate that carbs from fruits, pulses, which are legumes, beans, or whole grain products are associated with lower mortality and lower risk of cardiometabolic diseases, whereas refined carbs and added sugars, more specifically from sugar-sweetened beverages, are associated with higher risks. I don't think anyone's going to debate that. And they do go on to say that the underlying mechanisms responsible for the differences in health across carbohydrate-containing foods remain incompletely understood. So we need more. The study does provide some hypotheses on why that is. If you're interested, you can look at that. They go on to say that based on the physiological considerations and on human perspective and intervention studies, there is clear evidence that carbohydrate quality differs across various foods and has highly relevant importance for human health. It can be readily communicated for traditional unprocessed or minimally processed foods, such as whole grains and fresh fruit. But when it comes to packaged or ready-to-eat foods, a clear multi-dimensional definition of carbohydrate quality is required. So, from a practical point of view, they acknowledge that one major challenge imposed on nutritionists is how to communicate to the general population the best and the simplest way of identifying high-quality carbohydrates. So what does high-quality carbohydrate really mean? I don't think anyone's going to debate that a fresh piece of fruit is high quality, but if it's not fresh produce, how do we define high quality? In conclusion, there is increasing evidence that the effects of carbohydrate-containing foods on health-related outcomes vary widely according to the food sources, a phenomenon referred to as carbohydrate quality. There is strong evidence that the consumption of whole grain products and high dietary fiber intake are associated with benefits, whereas consumption of added sugars and refined carbohydrates is linked with adverse health outcomes. Again, this is not controversial. It's not a question of which is more important, quality versus quantity. You need to consider both. The great thing about selecting higher quality carbs, and that by higher quality, right now I'm saying carbohydrates containing more fiber, is that these food sources especially if they're unprocessed or minimally processed, like you're selecting fruits and veggies. They tend to fill you up. They tend to help you manage your hunger and your cravings, and they're going to be lower in total calories. So by selecting higher quality carbohydrates with higher fiber content, you have a great shot at lowering your total caloric intake while simultaneously increasing the nutrient density of your meals. So it's a win in every direction that you look. All right, moving on. Denise and I discussed the association with restrictive diets and disordered eating. And I want to be clear that I don't believe that going on low carb is going to cause an eating disorder. I have observed, though, that people with disordered eating often follow heavily restrictive diets, but that does not mean that following a restrictive diet will cause an eating disorder. So it appears to be far more complicated, unfortunately. And I think a good future episode should include a mental health professional who treats eating disorders to better discuss that association. But I do want to leave you with, I think, an interesting paper. This is going to be linked as PMID 35010751. The title is The Complicated Relationship Between Dieting, Dietary Restraint, Caloric Restriction, and Eating Disorders. They say some studies have reported that dieting typically precedes the development of eating disorders, which is what I mentioned that I've observed. But other studies have suggested that perhaps the relationship between restrained eating and overeating or eating disorders was far more complex. So they could be caused by current dieting, severe fasting, stress, or a negative effect. Thus, by 2021, numerous prospective risk factor studies had failed to support the primary hypothesis of dietary restraint theories, that it caused binge eating or other eating disorders. So results of controlled trials for weight management in adults, weight gain prevention, and eating disorder prevention in young people have failed to support the hypothesis of harmful effects caused by intent to diet or actual caloric restriction. Thus, neither the intention to diet nor actual caloric restriction appears to reliably result in eating disorder development. Rather, the results of these studies have consistently shown that healthy eating, exercise, and appropriate energy balance behaviors without the promotion of negative body image, shaming, or stigma can be safe and effective for the enhancement of physical and mental health. Current evidence suggests that dietary restraint is associated with eating disorder symptoms, but is not necessarily a causal factor in the etiology of eating disorders. It is possible that interactions exist where some specific forms of dieting or intent to diet are more harmful than others, but only for certain people. So that's why it gets kind of complicated. In conclusion, the risk and the benefits of dieting, dietary restraint, and caloric restriction have sparked great debate over the years. Available scientific evidence points to a conclusion that intentional dietary restriction, when conducted according to empirically validated programs, is both safe and effective for weight management and the prevention of eating disorders in individuals that have not been assessed to be vulnerable or at risk. And finally, Denise and I both recommended adequate fiber intake. One of the proposed benefits of fiber is the maintenance of a healthy digestive system. This claim is still debated, or it's debatable, because it seems like we don't know much about gut health yet. It's kind of an emerging area of research. It should be clear on which side of the fence Denise and I sit currently. We're obviously pro-fiber, but I want to provide some evidence and acknowledge that we do need more evidence. So this is going to be linked as PMID 34073366. The findings of this review have shown that dietary fiber can significantly increase the relative abundance of They list healthy gut bacteria, the specific bacteria. And it does significantly decrease total cholesterol and body mass index as compared to the control group. So that's good. However, the results of this study demonstrated that there were no significant differences between dietary fiber group and the control group with respect to triglycerides, HDL cholesterol, and LDL cholesterol, which is interesting because that's one thing that we talk about with increasing fiber intake is the positive effects on heart health. And then this paper is called The Role of the Gut Microbiota in Nutrition and Health. And they say we are entering an era where we can increasingly modify health through food and measure the effects through our microbes or metabolites. And fiber is a key nutrient for a healthy microbiome and has been overlooked while debates rage about sugar and fat. The adverse effects on the microbiome of drugs and processed food ingredients can no longer be ignored. This is obviously an opinion paper. Given the current gaps in knowledge, we need clinical evidence that can be translated into clinical practice, ideally through randomized control studies. We know gut health is important. We know fiber affects it. We need more research. Every study I read on fiber tends to state that we need more research, especially in reference to gut health. So if you are currently eating a low fiber diet and you are satisfied with the results, I'm happy for you. But for people who are dissatisfied with their health and their body composition, considering your fiber intake may be valuable. So as Denise mentioned, she recommends increasing fiber incrementally. You may benefit, though, from some guidance, especially if you're struggling or you're confused. Okay, that wraps up the epilogue. I hope you enjoyed the episode and look forward to our next episode. Denise and I will be discussing protein.